The subject that we're going to look at is a question, really, and it's a simple question. Like all questions, it doesn't have a simple answer. The question, of course, is, will Brexit affect the rights of employees? And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to kick off straight away by asking you both the simple answer, and then we can perhaps elaborate and see whether the simple answer satisfies us, which I suspect it doesn't. Just as an introduction, I think you hardly all need to know the huge impact that EU law has had on employment law in this country, on the rights of employees, working hours, time off, annual leave, equal pay, maternity rights, parental rights, agency worker protection. I mean, it is huge. And also, some of you may well be aware of the dangers of the current withdrawal bill, which I think we will talk about, and the clauses in there that could be very damaging. But let me open up, first of all, with you, Sue. Is the answer yes or no? Will it affect the rights? And what's your general view, if to the extent that you can share it with us?
Well, I think the answer is it won't affect the rights on day one, but that we shouldn't be limited in our consideration of this question to day one. The Prime Minister has set out some aspirations, and she has said that what will happen is that it will become a matter for the government of the day to decide. So I think actually I take a fairly realistic, maybe you will think pessimistic view of this, in that I think our rights will be affected beyond the immediate term. I think it will be relatively easy for a government to do that because they can do it by secondary legislation. I think we will lose the positive influence that the European Court of Justice has had on our employment law because we will now be subject to the rule of the Supreme Court in the UK. And for sure, we will miss out on any improvements in rights in EU law post-Brexit.
Richard, would that accord with your views?
Yes, I think it would be naive to assume that this isn't one of the ultimate objectives of those who were the main driving force for Brexit, namely the neoliberal right on the right wing of the Conservative Party. They dislike the single European market precisely because it is a market with rules. Rules to protect workers, rules to protect consumers, rules to protect the environment. Rules that could be better, I would say, as a Labour MEP, but nonetheless they are strong enough for the right wing to go apoplectic. They want a corporate free-for-all. It's precisely this that they want to undermine. And if you don't take my word for it, let's look at what some of them have said. Boris Johnson, scrap the social chapter. Liam Fox, it is intellectually unsustainable to believe that workplace rights should remain untouchable. Martin Callanan, their new minister in the House of Lords for Brexit, says he wants to scrap the Working Time Directive, the Agency Workers Directive, the Pregnant Workers Directive, and all the other barriers to actually employing people, as he puts it. So they let this slip out from time to time. They're now saying, no, we'll leave everything intact. But then why do they want to give themselves the Henry VIII powers that you mentioned, that would give the government, any future government, the rights to change such legislation by statutory instrument without going through a full legislative procedure through the British Parliament? I think the answer is obvious.
And Sue, as a trade union person then, I mean, how would you deal with the argument, well, by getting rid of all the regulation, we may well attract certain more investment into this country? Presumably what we would attract is bad employers.
I think that's right. I think we've got plenty of bad employers already, and I certainly think, and there's very strong evidence to show, that it's not employment legislation that holds back other employers from investing in the UK. We already have one of the most flexible employment law frameworks than any other country in Europe. What we want to attract, of course, is investment in the UK in the future. But think about the government's industrial strategy, on which I think there's a cross-party consensus that what we need is high-quality, value-added growth in the UK. And for sure, we're going to need that even more after Brexit. Well, those employers don't invest on the basis of lowest cost or lowest common denominator. Those employers invest in places where they have the right skills and expertise and where they have good investment conditions. So this is a complete red herring of an argument.
You share that view?
Yes, and of course the danger is that if we lower our standards, it triggers a race to the bottom, if indeed that were a factor in investment, because one of the whole points of having common rules for our common market across Europe is to make sure you don't have a race to the bottom where you try and compete by having lower standards. Also makes things easier for businesses to have a single set of rules instead of multiple sets of rules. But the danger is that if one country starts to lower its standards to supposedly get a competitive advantage, it puts pressure on the others to do likewise.
If we go back to the question, should I stay or should I go, what would you advise an EU trade union member of in those situations? Should I stay? Should I go? You've talked about that you're pessimistic, and clearly I think the impression you've given is that we should be very much on our guard. But what would be the advice?
Okay, well, so it's difficult for me to tell other people what to do. I am pessimistic, but I'm a trade unionist, so I'm not passively pessimistic. You can be pessimistic with a will to do something about it, and that's what I think we need to have. So we do absolutely need to be vigilant and on our guard, but we shouldn't be passively pessimistic. What I would say is for the members that my union represents, many of them are highly skilled scientists and engineers, people working in the heritage sector and so on. What I would say from my point of view is we want you to stay. We want you to stay, we want you to be able to bring your families, and we want you to live in the UK as fellow citizens, and we welcome you to do that, absolutely. And I say that not only because I think it's the right thing to do, but I also think it's the right thing for the British economy and British society. Now, I can't put myself in the position that I'm not in of being an EU citizen that has to make this choice. All I can say is that as a UK trade unionist representing lots and lots of EU citizens, we want you to stay.
And what would be your advice as a Labour MEP if somebody comes up to you and says, or somebody at lunch says to you, Richard?
Well, I'd say don't go yet, because there's still everything to fight for. As we heard from Chucker this morning, Brexit is not yet a done deal. And I think trade unions are among those who are beginning to say, there might still be a battle to fight here to avoid this sort of scenario. I think what's happening as well is not just whether the individuals wish to leave as a person, but what's going to happen in their sector of the economy if firms start to move and people having to move perhaps against their will or find another job against their will. And you can look through, aviation, agriculture, automobile, aeronautics. I'm only mentioning the ones that begin with the letter A, but you can go all the way to Z, where there are threats to employment, which is the most fundamental employment right of all, to have a job, and the risk that staying or going will be not just a matter of personal choice.
Can I just add to what I said? We're a politically independent trade union in Prospect, so we don't tell people how to vote, but we did ask our members how they voted after the referendum. 70% of them voted to stay, so they were considerably more positive than the economy, the UK as a whole. Now, I have to say that I have to respect the right of the 30% who voted to leave. What I don't have to accept and will not accept on behalf of our members is that we then put that deal, what leave looks like, in the hands of a few politicians. They didn't tell us what leave was going to look like. So what we're about very much at the moment is fighting to get the best possible outcome for everybody, including our EU colleagues and EU citizens. Now, whether at the end of the day Brexit ends up happening or not, as trade unionists we have to deal with the here and now. So when I say I'm pessimistic but not passively so, I believe that we have a real role to play in influencing what this looks like.
You both, sorry, please, Richard.
But the consequence surely is if, when the government comes back with a deal, if it's a bad deal, we must oppose it. No Brexit is better than a bad Brexit, even from the point of view of your 30%.
Absolutely. Well, what I think is that because people voted whichever way they voted, particularly Leave, without knowing what they were voting for, I think there is a compelling case for having a say on the final deal. Absolutely.
And question I have, which is, do you both, we've talked about the Henry VIII clauses and the ability to pass secondary legislation without scrutiny of Parliament. Is that a real, do you consider that a real danger, both of you?
Yes.
Is that a real issue? Because I think it's something that isn't talked about as often as it should be. I think many people haven't quite clicked what it means. And I'm just wondering whether, we should really be worried about that.
Well, absolutely, I think we should. For the trade union movement, the last big fight we had was over the Trade Union Act, which was passed in 2016. And this was a real issue during that act about putting into secondary legislation changes which would actually have a very significant impact. Now, the trade union movement as a whole fought very hard against that, and we did manage to make some difference to that. Now, at the end of the day, Parliament will pass the legislation that it passes, but ultimately what we've got to ensure is that they have a proper debate, a proper vote, and they're properly accountable to their constituents for the decisions that they take. It is a real danger. We've seen it very recently with the Trade Union Act, and we need to guard against it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Richard, you have
Certainly in Parliament at the moment, that's one of the most controversial aspects of the legislation that's going through. That although it would put the existing state of European law into national law on the day that Britain leaves, if we leave, it would empower the government to vary or repeal that legislation, or even vary or repeal national legislation that is affected by Brexit without going through a legislative procedure in Parliament. It's one of the biggest centralisations of power in the hands of the government in British history. So much for taking back control.
Yes. So much for taking back control. One of the things that cropped up this morning and is relevant, I think, to what we're talking about now, is the feeling of being less welcome, the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And I know it's difficult to talk about it without being anecdotal, but do you sense a feeling of unsettlement, a feeling of not being welcome? Is that something that in your union you've come across? And also, is it something that you're aware of, Richard, from your side? Because it's one of those woolly subjects that's difficult to pinpoint, but clearly is very much part of what's going on at the moment. Sue, have you noticed that? I think you did a survey, didn't you,
We
on
did
this?
a survey, yeah. We did a survey of our members who are EU citizens last autumn. This is one of the questions that we asked, and we had literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of comments back from members. Some of them really heartbreaking and emotional comments. People who've lived in this country for decades, who felt that they were part of the UK's fabric of society, suddenly finding that their accent, their comments, anything about them that became visible to people was the subject of comment, feeling very uncomfortable, feeling that they were no longer in the society that they thought they were in. I think it's shameful. It makes me ashamed as a UK citizen that is going on. And I think it's atrocious, whoever it applies to. And I think it will be one of those issues, actually, that ultimately is what makes people's minds up about whether to stay or to go.
Can I just quick follow up on that before I go to you, Richard? Was there any demographic in those answers? Did you notice any demographic?
Well, interestingly, the answers came from members working across a range of different industries and sectors. The only demographic that really stood out as being different was from people who lived in Scotland, where obviously Scotland voted to remain. Maybe there are other aspects of living in Scotland that make it a kinder society, but they clearly don't feel it as much as people as in the rest of the UK.
Richard, can you comment a little bit on this subject that's difficult to define and to quantify, the feeling?
Very simply, I get the same in my mailbag as a member of the European Parliament from constituents, especially those who come from other European countries, who very much give the same answer, so I won't repeat them.
Yeah. To pick up on something you said to me earlier, Richard, use 3 words when we were talking generally about today and about Brexit, and they struck me. I'm going to read them to you and ask you just to comment on them. Maybe then, Sue, you could comment on them as well. And I asked you what people you meet, particularly in Europe, outside when you're traveling, what they feel. And you said 3 words: disbelief, sadness, and exasperation. Would you like to just expand upon those 3 words?
Disbelief that we could have taken such a decision in such, as they would see it, a frivolous way, a government that was trying to settle an internal argument with its own party by having a badly prepared referendum and failing dismally to make the case. The second word was
Sadness.
Sadness that Britain is likely to be leaving. They feel a sense of loss. It's not a good thing for the EU either to lose a member state for the first time in its history, and Britain has contributed to the richness and the diversity of the European Union. And exasperation with the government in the negotiations, not knowing what it actually wants, or making demands in combination with red lines, which make those demands impossible to reconcile with those red lines. There is a huge element of frustration, notwithstanding the agreements announced a couple of hours ago on the end of on the transition. The transition is a minor part of the jigsaw puzzle, and even that's not fully settled by what they announced. The sort of overwhelming sense of exasperation with the British government.
And do you think, Sue, that your members, and do you personally feel that exasperation, that frustration? I mean, given, you've been trade unionists for years, I mean, is this a new feeling for you? Is there more exasperation than perhaps you felt in other battles you fought as a trade unionist? Does it feel different to you this time round?
It feels different simply, I think, because nobody was expecting it, and if you looked at the merits of the arguments, that's why you wouldn't have expected it to happen. So there is a great sense of exasperation. The fact that people have been kept in limbo, in uncertainty for such a long period as well, really adds to that exasperation. And the word that I would add to Richard's list really is anger. Anger that we've been told one thing, that this is about taking back control, and actually it's nothing to do with that. It's about taking people's control over their own lives away from them. And so there's a real sense of anger too.
Yeah, and I would add one other word to that list: betrayal. A real sense of betrayal. I feel betrayed, but I think our European partners feel betrayed. And I think betrayal is a powerful word that we shouldn't underestimate. Do you, if you could wave a magic wand, if you could, what are your hopes for the next? Let's not take it all the way. What are your hopes for the next 6 months, each of you? What would you like to see happen? Is there anything that, if you were in control, what would you do at this juncture, as a trade unionist and as an MEP?
I think that's a difficult question.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're trying to do, and we'll be working hard at over the next 6 months, is actually to stop this being a debate that's happening only in certain places and make it a debate that's relevant to everyone and everywhere in very direct terms about how it's going to affect everybody's lives. People want to know that when they use the NHS, there will be the skilled staff available to help them. People want good, quality, decent, secure jobs. People want an end to uncertainty. Now, there's a political debate going on, and I understand the significance of the slight shifts in manoeuvre that we get here and there. but that's not getting across to all of our members in all of the country. We need to, I think, to be much better at communicating what's at stake here, so that if we do get in a position where people have an opportunity to have a say on the outcome, that this time they really understand what they're voting for.
Yeah. And Richard, if you had a magic wand for the next 6 months?
It depends how imaginative you want me to be, because ideally
go on, be very imaginative.
I would love to see a leading Leave campaigner have the courage to say, we were wrong, we got it wrong. Politicians don't usually change their mind in that way. But maybe at least the Prime Minister could say, now that we've explored the options, they're all bad, we need to reconsider. I would love that. But I suppose more realistically is that when the Prime Minister comes back with a deal, which will be, let's face it, a jobs-destroying deal, a bad deal, a costly deal, a complicated deal, that Parliament at that point rejects the deal. That's not impossible. The Labour Party has laid down some red lines which the deal is almost certainly not going to meet. Labour logically must vote against the deal. The Liberal Democrats, and I welcome the leader of the Liberal Democrats who's just arrived, will no doubt vote against the deal because it will be a bad deal. So will the SNP, the Green, the Welsh Nationalists. It would need about 15, 20 courageous Conservative MPs to rebel for the deal to fall. Pro-European Conservatives have a very important role to play. If you know any, be nice to them, cherish them. I suggested they should be listed under the CITES Convention as an endangered species, afforded special protection against their nasty predators. But they may well have a very important role here. And if the deal is defeated, what happens then? Well, it's a defeat of such magnitude for the government, it might trigger a general election. It might not. But what happens to Brexit? Rejecting the deal cannot mean leaving without a deal. Nobody voting to reject it supports leaving without a deal. You cannot construe that to be the will of Parliament. Therefore, rejecting it can only mean one of two things. Renegotiate a different deal, or reconsider Brexit entirely. The scope for renegotiation might not be very great. So then you have to bite the bullet and say, now that we've seen what Brexit actually entails, we need to reconsider.
I know we're short of time, and I think you'll be around a bit if anybody wants to ask questions. I just would like to say that may your voices continue to be loud. Both of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.